Dr. Omo sat in silence, the soft hum of her machines the only sound in a sterile lab. The lights overhead flickered for a moment before stabilizing, casting a cold glow on the row of test tubes lined up in front of her. In each one, the same dark serum, her own blood, spun in a centrifuge, separating into its different components. She was immune. She didn't know why, not yet. But it was her only advantage, and she had to find out why her body wasn't succumbing to the disease. With so many women dead or dying, Omo knew she was a living anomaly. She couldn't afford to fail, not when hope was all but gone. Her gloved hands moved steadily, extracting the separated plasma, sliding it under the microscope. Her eyes narrowed as she zoomed in, adjusting the magnification until the individual cells came into focus. They looked ordinary, normal, but she knew they weren't. Somewhere in her genetic makeup, in the blood running through her veins, was the key to saving what was left of the female population. She didn't trust Fennel. His obsession with creating life, these artificial beings, seemed a distraction, a twisted ego trip masked as science. But this wasn't about creation. It was about survival, and she knew there had to be a cure. Her thoughts drifted to the women who had been brought to the lab. They had been bussed in, mostly by force, desperate and terrified. Fennel had used them in his experiments, offering them sanctuary in exchange for their bodies. But Omo couldn't just watch them die. She had set up her lab in the farthest section of the fortress, away from his prying eyes, and started her own research. And then there was the anomaly. Omo's immune system seemed to fight the disease effortlessly. No symptoms, no decay. She had injected herself with samples of infected blood time and time again, and still her body resisted. But why? There was a knock at the door, snapping her from her thoughts. A young woman stood in the doorway, her face pale, eyes sunken, one of the latest survivors to arrive at the lab. "Dr. Omo, it's time for my treatment," she said softly, her voice trembling. She knew she didn't have long. Omo glanced at the centrifuge. She had barely begun the latest round of tests, but there was no time to waste. "Come in," she said, her voice calm, though inside a storm of urgency brewed. Fennel watched the new batch of beings as they stood, motionless in their containment units. Their eyes were closed, their bodies perfectly still, suspended in the warm, gel-like fluid that kept them alive. They were his greatest achievement yet, stronger, faster, more advanced than the first generation. "These ones will not question me," he murmured to himself. "These ones will understand their purpose." The rebellion brewing among Eve and the others had forced his hand. He had to ensure that his creations remained loyal, obedient. The future of mankind depended on it. Behind him, the door slid open, and Dr. Omo stepped into the lab. Her presence was rare in this part of the facility, but not unwelcome. Fennel turned to greet her, his eyes betraying a flicker of curiosity. "Dr. Omo," he said, folding his arms across his chest, "what brings you to my side of the lab?" "I wanted to see what you've been working on," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Your creations." Fennel smirked, motioning toward the containment units. "Impressive, aren't they? The future of mankind perfectly designed, stronger than any human could ever hope to be." Omo approached the glass, staring at the beings floating in their artificial wombs. She felt a shiver run down her spine. "And yet, they're not human." "Humanity is flawed," Fennel replied, his voice growing sharper. "You of all people should understand that by now. You've seen what's happening out there. Society is crumbling. Men are tearing each other apart. The women are almost gone. If we don't adapt, we won't survive." Omo's gaze remained fixed on the beings, her thoughts drifting to the survivors in her wing of the lab. The ones who still had hope, the ones she was fighting to save. "And what happens when your creations turn on you?" she asked quietly. Fennel chuckled, though there was no warmth in the sound. "They won't. They can't. I've made sure of that." Omo didn't respond. She knew better than to argue with him. He was too far gone, too wrapped up in his own vision of the future to see the danger in what he was doing. "I'm close to a cure," she said instead, changing the subject. "I've been working with my own blood. There's something in it, an anomaly. I think it could be the key to reversing the disease." Fennel's eyes darkened, his smile fading. "A cure? You think you can stop what's already in motion?" Omo turned to face him fully, her expression calm but resolute. I'm not creating a new species. I'm trying to save the one we have." Fennel stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There is no saving them. Don't you see? The disease is nature's way of cleansing the earth, of wiping away the old to make way for the new. My creations, our creations, are the future, not them." Omo held her ground. "You're wrong, Fennel. If there's a chance, even a small one, that I can find a cure, I have to try. We owe it to the women who are still alive. We owe it to humanity." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room crackled like static electricity, a battle of wills fought in silence. Finally, Fennel stepped back, his expression hardening. "Do what you must," he said coldly. "But remember this, when your cure fails, and it will, I'll be the only one left standing." Omo returned to her lab, her mind racing with the confrontation she had just left behind. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, not just for the women in her care, but for the entire human race. Fennel's experiments were getting more dangerous, more radical, and she couldn't stand by and watch him replace humanity with his artificial creations. The young woman from earlier sat on the examination table, her hands trembling as she clutched a thin blanket around her shoulders. "Is it working?" the woman asked, her voice small. Omo approached with a syringe in hand, filled with her latest serum. "I hope so," she said softly, though doubt gnawed at the edges of her confidence. As she injected the serum into the woman's arm, she prayed that this time it would work, that the anomaly in her own blood would finally unlock the cure. But in the back of her mind, she knew the truth. She was running out of time. Fennel's eyes glowed with a mix of pride and anxiety as he watched the newest generation of his creations emerge. They were stronger, taller, and even more resilient than the last. Each one had been meticulously designed to be perfect, free from the flaws that had led to questions, to rebellion. "Generation 3, he murmured, as the new beings blinked their eyes open, their bodies slowly adjusting to the new environment. Unlike the previous generations, these beings had been created with a specific inhibitor, something that dampened their ability to question, to feel. They would be obedient, compliant, perfect. The thought of Eve's defiance still haunted him. She had been the most advanced of the first batch, but her intelligence had also made her dangerous. She had become too aware, too thoughtful. And that had led to the questions, the doubts. Fennel had seen the way the others looked to her, the way they listened. It was only a matter of time before she would try to turn them against him. He couldn't allow that, not when everything was at stake. One of the new beings, a male, stepped forward. His movements were fluid, almost mechanical, as if he was still learning how to use his own limbs. He had no name yet. None of them did. Names were given only to those who survived the early phases, those who proved themselves strong and worthy. Fennel approached him, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Do you understand who I am?" he asked, his voice calm, almost soothing. The being nodded, his expression blank. "You are the creator." "Good," Fennel said. "And do you understand your purpose?" "To serve," the being replied. "To build a new world." Fennel's smile widened. This was how it should be. No questions, no rebellion, just acceptance. "Excellent," he said, stepping back. "You will be the beginning of something greater than humanity ever could have been." But as he turned to leave the room, a flicker of movement caught his eye. One of the previous generation beings, Cain, stood in the doorway, watching with a mix of curiosity and something else. Something Fennel couldn't quite place. Defiance, perhaps. "You're making more," Cain said, his voice low. "Yes," Fennel replied, his tone sharp. "More that will understand their purpose, unlike you." Cain didn't flinch. "And what happens to us then, when you don't need us anymore?" Fennel felt a chill run down his spine. It was a question he had been avoiding, even in his own thoughts. "You will continue to serve," he said, his voice cold, "or you will be replaced." He left the room without another word, the door hissing shut behind him. But as he walked down the hall, the image of Cain's expression lingered in his mind. The way his eyes had burned, not with fear, but with anger. It was a dangerous sign, and it meant he would need to accelerate his plans.